Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Ondřej Dietrich. I'm the senior analyst for Russia and the Eastern Neighborhood at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to another in the series of our online discussions where we engage experts and public and where we discuss our research. Today, it's a very special opportunity because we will be speaking about a long-read report, Unpowering Russia, which the EUISS has published 2 weeks ago. The report is available online on our website. It will also shortly be available in print, and you are welcome to order a free copy if you like. And in the report, which has nearly 100 pages, we cover 5 regions and three domains where we believe the EU should empower Russia. Today, I am joined by 4 of my colleagues and co-authors of this report. It is Lisa Bomasi, our research analyst for Indo-Pacific, Nadia Kovalčíková, our senior analyst for transnational security, 𝐃𝐢𝐭𝐫𝐲𝐜𝐡, our senior analyst for the Middle East and North Africa, and Kasper Hobhaus, our research analyst for energy security. So before I pass the floor to them to let them speak a little bit about the chapters and their fields. From an sort of organizational perspective, we will do a sort of brief overview of the report as such, and then these sort of selected regions and domains. But we also want to leave plenty of time for your questions and your feedback on either what you will have heard or the report as such, if you've had a chance to read through it. So please don't hesitate to ask questions as we go on LinkedIn. The questions will be passed to us, and in the second section of this debate, we will try our best to answer them. So the very idea of empowering Russia, what is it, and what is it premised on? The basic premise is that the EU needs to get better at defending against and countering Russia's tactics, which are aimed at hurting its interests. And this has several pillars. One is the need to improve resilience, in particular against the more reckless, multidimensional threats to institutions and to critical infrastructures. And there's a second pillar, and that is deterrence. Increasing costs of Russia's hybrid campaigns through asymmetric responses, including asymmetric responses. Of course, improving also conventional deterrence, and this is very much the order of the day. But the idea behind this project that in addition to resilience and deterrence, there should also be a third pillar, and this is empowering. And what is empowering? Empowering does not mean erasing or extinguishing Russia's power, Russia as a state. Russia is a power. It is a great power. But empowering Russia, in our understanding, is about limiting Russia's capacity through measures sort of across the board, across various regions and domains, to first of all wage war against Ukraine. This is where empowering starts, but also challenge the EU's interest elsewhere through sort of globalized hybrid warfare campaigns. So the idea is that the EU should be more active at disabling Russia where and whenever it acts against our interests. And the report sort of delivers sort of a comprehensive analysis and balanced assessment, hopefully, of Russia's strengths, but also its weaknesses and the EU's response options to contribute sort of from strategic playbook, if you like, how to deal with Russia in the long term, because the premise behind our report is, unfortunately, and this is not the EU's choice, of course, that we are sort of locked in this state of confrontation with Russia, and this will take a potentially long time. So, any efforts to counter Russia's actions against the EU's interest must begin with sort of a balanced assessment of its strengths and, critically, also its vulnerabilities. And forcing others to see Russia through, say, a magnifying glass, if you will, has been a sort of a hallmark of Moscow's information warfare. And Nadia may shortly speak a little bit more on that. And the overall picture emerging from the analysis, including in our report, which I should say is by necessity somewhat selective, of course, because it draws on the collective expertise of the EUISS analysts. So not all potentially interesting topics, areas, and fields are covered. But the overall picture, nonetheless, emerging from these analyses is that Russia is indeed quite adept in some areas, but it's also exposed to vulnerabilities in others. Russia, just to give an example, is very good at opportunistically exploiting frictions and vulnerabilities of others, while combining its own very limited assets for better cumulative effects. So it's very good at compensating for inherent structural vulnerabilities in, for example, the military and economy domains, critical domains, by investing in shaping global information environment. Nadia will again speak a little bit more on this in just a minute. It's very good at fomenting anxiety about conflict escalation among European publics, including as related to support to Ukraine, ongoing support to Ukraine. It's very good at supporting divisive political forces and steering ethnic tensions, for example, also through exploiting Slavic and Orthodox heritage in the Western Balkans. Our colleague Bojana writes about this in her chapter on West Balkans, which is part of the report. Russia is also quite good at deploying what previously called normative power Russia, projecting a certain self-image, trying to shape the information and environment. And it's also quite good at making use of extensive diplomatic and espionage network, of course, that it has at its disposal. It's good at putting together sort of makeshift assemblages, if you like the Shadow Fleet, on which Casper will speak shortly, to bypass obstacles that are placed in its way. Or another case, of course, is Wagner Africa Corps, sort of a makeshift assemblage, if you will, to compensate for weaknesses compared to other major powers, which have sort of, or seek a footprint in the Middle East, mostly in Africa. But beyond this mask of strength that Kremlin very painstakingly seeks to construct, there are numerous vulnerabilities in its increasingly critical relationship with China, for example, which prioritizes its own interests, deepening dependencies, their yield asymmetric gains. So Russia, of course, can't have it all. So it's deepening ties with China, but this limits its appeal to India or ASEAN, and concentration of resources in one place, such as Ukraine, leads to losses elsewhere, as in Syria. Kasia may speak a little bit more on that later on. Russia has a weak economic footprint across regions compared to major external powers. It loses some of the traditional levers of influence, such as arms trade, which has suffered a sharp decline with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Russia's economy is critically dependent on stable revenue from oil exports, and Russia is putting, therefore, in place, again, makeshift and opaque solutions to circumventing sanctions in order to deliver oil to its customers. But these are vulnerable including to concerted regulatory scrutiny, for example. So I could go on and on, but not to eat too much time of the discussion. Let me just very briefly sort of outline in which direction our recommendations goes. They can be clustered in a way. I mean, if you read the report, they are also organized in terms of, let's say, time in which they can be put in place, but they can also be clustered by theme. So one cluster is stepping up the contest of ideas, challenging Russia's disinformation and propaganda, right? Systematically decoding and exposing contradictions and hypocrisies in Moscow's messaging, better anticipating and pre-bunking. So that's one cluster of recommendations that you will find throughout the report. And the second cluster is tightening the material screws, increasing economic and diplomatic price to Chinese support to Russia, including through better screening, freezing critical exports of dual-use materials or the sensitive materials, tightening sanctions, of course, and expanding them to Russia's regional proxies, or harnessing regulatory power and policing capacities to disrupt the flow of seabound oil coming from Russia. Again, Kasper will speak on this in a minute. And then the third pillar is harnessing global alliances. So Russia is not alone, of course, in this contestation, but neither is the EU, and the EU can offer better relationships to partners in the regions, supporting their improved standing in global institutions, investing in clustered development, etc. So let me stop here with this very brief overview of the report as a whole, and let's now dig in some specific areas, as I said, regions and domains. And let's start with the hybrid and sort of information warfare waged by Russia worldwide. So let me pass the floor now to Nadia. So Nadia, how can the EU be better at disabling Russia's global propaganda and disinformation machine?
Thanks a lot, Andrzej, and good morning to everyone who is with us today. Indeed, Russia has been very active. It's not new to any of us that Russia is very capable when it comes to the hybrid threats, especially, as you mentioned, the information manipulation, disinformation campaigns, which are often, if not almost mostly, combined with other attacks in the digital sphere or also non-digital sphere, in cyberspace, attacks on critical infrastructure, sabotages, but also we have noticed increasing political assassinations, use of malign finance, and these other tools of hybrid warfare that Russia has been exploiting. And one of the ways we can try to better address it is to really compile and connect these different attacks, threats that in combination can be seen as hybrid threats and the broader hybrid warfare that Russia has been waging. And since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, now more than 3 years, but more than 3 years, Russia's aggression, not only against Ukraine and in its near abroad, so-called perceived sphere of influence, but also in a more global perspective. And you have already nicely outlined it, Andrzej, with the chapters of our colleagues that are touching upon different regions and also showcase these specific destabilizing activities of Russia in these other regions beyond Europe. But with a focus on Europe, Ukraine, neighboring countries of the EU and the EU as such, we have seen that since this full-scale invasion in Ukraine, the dominance of cyber attacks and information manipulation was quite visible, in addition to all the other tools of interference. And one of the ways that I've been thinking in my chapter to showcase the vulnerability of Russia was this mismatch between what Russia has been doing, what Russia continues to do, and what Russia says. And these contradictions and hypocrisy of Russia's activities that have been increasing in this period of the last few years, and when everyone pays more attention to these more covered operations that may precede or accompany, but also many times connect to the military kinetic operations of Russia, and we no longer see Russia's aggression without the use of hybrid tools. These contradictions and hypocrisy is really standing out. There are three ways I saw it has been exemplifying quite clearly. One of the ways was when Russia is dismissing any kind of positive role of the EU or the West, and contrary to that, actually tries to justify its own aggression and divert attention from its aggression in the public sphere, and accuses the West of the hegemonical behavior that actually Russia pursues itself with its neo-imperial ambitions. This has been, of course, one of the very also sensitive areas where we have been able to see how Russia's systemic violence and repression and its own colonial past, and we could even say present, has been in full contradiction with its narratives. Secondly, Russia is presenting itself as a leader of a world majority, as they say, a world majority, as a staunch defender of international law, of protection of civilians, while actually in practice continuously and systematically and increasingly violates international treaties and agreements. And in the chapter on hybrid warfare, I invite all the listeners and readers to review the most perhaps recent but also past breaches of international law that very much showcase this hypocrisy of Russia that is then exploited in the information space and could be considered as Russia's vulnerability better exposed and addressed. And thirdly, just to finalize, in this context, we can see how we can actually fight against it. And this is coming back to what you said. How can we disable these operations better? One way, especially when it comes to the information space, is to make sure that we do not create measures and activities isolated from the other domains of hybrid warfare that Russia is deploying simultaneously, and have this more integrated analytical approach across different domains. Secondly, being able to think of these psychological defense operations of Russia in the way that we can create more European level psychological defense approach within maybe EU at a more coordinated in a more coordinated way, and then use existing tools that we have through our databases and organizations to come up with more anticipatory threat assessments. So this would be one way to approach that. Second way would be for the EU, considering the geopolitical context and also the attention and resources being placed in protecting and defending Europe and, of course, the world against aggression and hostilities by Russia, to continue tighten the regulations against social media companies that enable the spread of manipulated information, these different campaigns being amplified in inauthentic way. And therefore, I think one of my second recommendations to support here would be to really tighten these regulatory measures. And the third one would be to integrate the considerations for countering hybrid warfare within the current ongoing discussions on the defense budget, and how to better target and allocate the resources when it comes to active defense against hybrid warfare within these defense discussions that are ongoing at the EU level to better counter also information manipulation, but other tools of foreign interference or hybrid warfare that hostile actors are using against democracies, to destabilize also and divide and drive these wedges between different countries, between different groups of society, but also to just continue destabilizing and distracting attention from where we should focus in order to preserve our own security and democracy. So these are a few recommendations, really advocating for this dual strategy of the EU in one way to defend against actively, but also to resist at the same time and continue building the resilience. But one or the other is not going to be sufficient if it's not combined and we don't have this dual approach of resistance and active defense.
Oh, brilliant. Many thanks, Nadia. I'm sure we will come back to this. I have some backup questions if we don't have any immediately from the audience once the presentations are over. But let's now move to Casper, because there is a lot of propaganda narratives, a lot of disinformation that flow out of Russia, but there is also quite a lot of oil, and it all, I invite you to check the report. We have some very good visuals, as always, designed by our colleague Christian Dietrich, and one rather amazing one is in Casper's chapter, sort of showing how the oil is transported and how much it sort of encircles the European continent at, among other things, quite substantial environmental risk. But without further ado, Casper, floor is yours.
Taking my comments before saying them, but no, absolutely. So I think in some ways on the energy sphere, Unpowering Russia was the perfect title, because I believe the starting point we have to take is that effectively without fossil fuels, the Russian state would be incapable of waging the conflict and the war that it is currently waging and being able to maintain the societal stability, the functioning of the state as it currently does. According to most recent data, about 600 million euros every day flow into the Russian coffers from fossil fuel exports, of which 200 million are seaborne oil, which is where I will narrow down. But I think it's always important to remember that this is it's fossil fuels in general that power the Russian state, which is everything from oil to gas to coal. And so without that, this is a key vulnerability for the Russian state. That's the starting point. So Russia has seen this as a vulnerability and has clearly invested huge resources into being able to continue to access the global market. And that's where we come around to the shadow fleet, which is an ever-changing entity. Literally since writing this report, it continues to adapt and change itself, but is now over 1,000 vessels, most of which are old, creaky, decrepit entities which are upwards of 20 years old, massively environmentally damaging, all sorts of problems relating to them. They use flags of convenience. They turn off their AIS, their automatic identification systems. They are a menace to global waters, and they're an increasing presence, as any official, particularly in the Baltic states, will tell you. I think the other part to this, which was a major part of my chapter, is that then to not just understand the shadow fleet as solely a wave that Russia uses to ensure its steady flow of seaborne oil revenues, but also as a weapon of hybrid warfare. As we saw, particularly towards the end of 2024, there was routine accidents. The floating comments is intentional because I would draw the conclusion that these are purposeful, targeted attacks against European critical infrastructure, in particular in the Baltic states, where shadow fleet vessels have been related to the severing of undersea cables, both telecommunications and electricity. And this constitutes a major threat to the European state. So what to then do? As Andre already alluded to, with the visual, I think nicely captures the fact that Russia is effectively tying a noose around the European continent with its shadow fleet, with these creaky old vessels that are sailing through European waters unhindered, around through, but obviously particularly the Baltic. About 60% of Russian seaborne oil flows originate in the Baltic. They flow through the Baltic all the way around the North Sea, through the Mediterranean, through the Black Sea. They are a continental menace, and it is effectively an accident waiting to happen. These are old vessels, and that will cause serious problems for any state when that day comes. So I think to move swiftly on then to the conclusions of this, I'd say it was very simple. We need to find a way to stop this from happening. And it's a hybrid response and a hybrid attack on the European continent. So we need to find creative ways in which to respond to this. So instead of reacting, instead of finding systems of resilience, which are of course very important as well, there needs to be more concrete policing of waters. And effectively, that's my main conclusion with other associated conclusions, is that the European states, particularly the littoral states, need to be much more active in stopping, searching, preventing, and preventing Russia from exporting all this oil in very, very dangerous and risky manners through European waters. And that requires a shift in cooperation. It requires a shift in intelligence cooperation, but also a shift in mentality to move against some of the old sort of systems which legally feel to constrain, but though I would argue do not constrain as much as people think. And so yeah, I think that would be my main argument, is that we need to stop this in order to be able to hurt the Russian state. That's how to unpower Russia.
Thank you, Kasper. Thank you very much. Let's now move to the regions. We can trace those decrepit oil tankers as they pass through the Middle East and to the shore, passed through the shores of North Africa and the Middle East, through the Suez and to the Indo-Pacific. Well, let's start with Indo-Pacific. I mean, in the report we have a chapter on China, as I mentioned in the introduction. The relationship between Russia and China is now critically important. China plays the role of the critical enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine, and there are sort of different facets of the relationship. Another one is in the Arctic, another sort of area of our interest here at the EUISS currently. But China is one thing, but then we have the Indo-Pacific as a region, and we are lucky that we have Lisa with us today, and also that Lisa has contributed to the report, which she may now briefly introduce from her perspective. So Lisa, please.
Thank you, Andre, and hello everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is really unpack how Russia has sought to reorient itself in the Indo-Pacific. So really looking at what Russia's doing, the limits and contradictions it faces, and I think importantly, what that means for the EU. And if there's one message I want to leave you with, it's this: Russia's pivot in the Indo-Pacific, it seems to be driven by necessity, not by deep structural advantage. So let's start with Russia's playbook in the region. As we know, Russia's war in Ukraine has cut Moscow off from much of the West. So the Indo-Pacific has become one of those alternative lifelines, a region where Moscow hopes to sustain its relevance and shore up its war-strained economy. Now, bear in mind that Russia isn't new to the region. The Soviet Union laid down a foundation of military, educational, and diplomatic ties stretching back decades. But I think today that motivation seems to be much more urgent. So how is Russia actually doing this? There are 4 areas that I looked at in the report: economic, military, diplomatic, and informational. And you'll see this sort of crosses across the chapters also in the report. Economically, Russia's footprint is strikingly thin. You mentioned this, Andre. In the Indo-Pacific, if we take, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, trade in 2023 was 15 billion euro. compared to over 250 billion euro in EU ASEAN trade. Even with India, which is a long-time partner of Russia, trade is only half the EU's total with New Delhi. That's a significant gap. And I think it implies that Russia can't realistically compete in the big picture. So it narrows its focus to energy and arms. And these, I think, are the real economic levers that Moscow uses. But even in energy, which is supposed to be the Kremlin's strong suit, Russia's position is fragile. There are increasing reports highlighting how energy projects are stalling at the early stages. We see examples of this in Indonesia. So to keep those oil revenues flowing, Moscow has turned to workarounds, using intermediaries in the region to launder, blend, and rebrand oil to bypass the sanctions. It's a short-term fix that exploits these governance gaps in the regions, but it's not a stable foundation for the future. Militarily, Russia leans on arms sales as a diplomatic wedge. Key buyers include India, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, but it's also been a tool of influence, like Moscow's moves to hamper European observer status at the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, which is a key security forum. But here again, the trends are turning. India, for example, used to source 72% of its arms from Russia in the early 2010s, and that's dropped to 36% in the last few years. India is also diversifying its suppliers, France, Israel, the US, and I think this has, real long-term implications for Russia's position as an arms provider. Now, diplomatically, Russia's role is defined by a lot of hedging. Moscow's relationship with Beijing puts it in a tight spot. It avoids taking explicit stances on flashpoints like the South China Sea, except Taiwan. But that makes it hard to build credibility with littoral states like the Philippines, who see China's expansionism as a real threat. Informationally, Russia tries to compensate for these limitations with a sort of bifocal approach. This is short-term disruption and longer-term narrative building. So in the short term, Russian state media outlets like RT and Sputnik amplify narratives about Western hypocrisy, double standards, NATO expansionism. Nadia mentioned this earlier. These narratives can actually resonate in parts of the Indo-Pacific. Surveys that I looked at have shown surprisingly high levels of public sympathy for Russia in countries like Bangladesh, Malaysia, Thailand. Longer term, it's about shaping perceptions of Russia as an alternative pole of power. So the Ruski Mir Foundation, the Rosotrudnichestvo agency offers scholarships. Nominally, it's about 15,000 a year compared to 2,500 under the EU's Erasmus Mundus program. And even though the data is quite difficult to come by, the sources that I've consulted indicate that countries like Cambodia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, these are frequently part of these outreach initiatives. It's this sort of slow burn influence, cultivating future leaders and fostering diplomatic ties. So what does that all mean for the EU? I think Russia's limitations and the region's cautious yet adaptive posture offer avenues for us to engage as a partner of choice. The first way is to help the region address these structural vulnerabilities that Russia exploits. That means offering alternatives that reduce the need for countries to rely on Russian deals that might not be sustainable or secure. In energy, for example, the EU strengthened renewables and clean tech. These can be a real draw. Investing in credible alternatives, green infrastructure, transparent co-financing can help countries in the region move beyond dependence on informal energy flows. The second way is to challenge Russia's narrative control. But here it's not about fighting fire with fire. Instead, the EU could focus on strengthening independent information ecosystems within the region itself. That means sharing the lessons learned and countering hybrid threats in Europe, but also using smart, tailored public diplomacy, supporting journalistic standards and integrity, backing fact-based media outlets, and really significantly expanding our educational partnerships. These can act as, these sort of long-term defenses against disinformation. The third point, and this is essential, is to show up consistently. Presence and credibility, they don't come from occasional high-level fly-ins. This comes from regular engagement across all levels, political dialogues, security cooperation, cultural programs, economic ties, people-to-people connections. Maintaining that steady, reliable presence is really important. And I'll stop there. Andre, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Excellent overview. I think what really stands out, of course, many themes appear across the chapters, like countering the informational dominance, but also helping our partners reduce their dependencies. Of course, the word of the day in the EU is, of course, that we should reduce our own critical dependencies, but also helping others to do so may be good policy. So we already are collecting quite a number of questions, which we will address in the order that we receive them. But before we do that, Kasia, please tell us a bit about the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you, Andre. And I'll be brief because I do see a lot of questions, and also because a lot of what I was going to say has already been covered by my colleagues, and especially Lisa, in terms of the situation in the MENA. There's a lot of similarity regarding the way that Russia is operating in the Middle East and North Africa region. Of course, there Russia is not a newcomer either. It's been present for a long time. But it has expanded its presence significantly after 2011. And currently, I would say Russia's goals in the MENA region focus, first of all, on kind of this broader power projection and undermining the EU presence and leverage in the region. And also more immediately, because of ongoing war effort in Ukraine, Russia is using MENA as kind of a gateway to Africa to try to finance its war efforts. Kaspar spoke more extensively about the use of the shadow fleet. So in particular in the Mediterranean, Russia is using the shadow fleet to circumvent the sanctions, but also to trade gold, illicitly trade, of course, so smuggle gold, smuggle precious materials from Africa through the Middle Eastern countries to Russia in order to be able to finance the ongoing war in Ukraine. Pretty much, as is the case in Asia-Pacific, as Lisa explained, Russia doesn't have that much to offer in traditional economic terms. So when you look at the trade data, at the FDI, Russia's economic footprint is really minimal, especially compared to that of the EU. The EU is the main trade partner for the vast majority of the countries in the MENA region. So what Russia does offer, and again, pretty much as is the case in the Asia-Pacific, the offer is more tailored not for the population so much as for various authoritarians. So it's trade in arms, here predominantly previously in Syria, of course, but trade in arms with Iran, with Libya, with Algeria, Iraq, and Egypt to a lesser extent, and providing support to those various authoritarian regimes. Of course, now with the fall of the Assad regime in December, we saw that Russia is not always really ready and able to be this guarantor of security and provider of immunity for authoritarians. So, of course, Russia is playing this narrative of saving actually the Assad and evacuating him and the family, and trying to spin the narrative to claim that the regime did not want to save itself and there was nothing for Russia to do, and actually helped Assad to survive in personal capacity. But with the fall and change of regime in Syria, it became very clear that Russia does not have this capacity to be guarantor of security for various authoritarian clients that it has had in the region. In terms of what Russia has been doing, with the outreach towards population. Again, nothing new, nothing different. Nadia already covered this more extensively, and Lisa also mentioned, so the disinformation campaign, trying to sow confusion, in the MENA region, particularly trying to use the pre-existing sentiments against the EU. And this is where Russia's actions have been working. So not just through using its own communication channels, not just through RT Arabic, but also, and this is more dangerous, I would say, through different information sharing arrangements with local media, which means that populations reading, the local news outlets in Algiers or in Rabat, they're de facto reading Russian content without knowing it, because of this sharing agreements that Russians have with multiple local media channels in the region. But what Russia has been able to achieve this way is not so much increasing in its own popularity, which hasn't really changed despite different campaigns, both to play against the EU and, for instance, to leverage Russia's position when it comes to the war in Gaza. So the perceptions of Russia in the region remain fairly the same. I mean, rather positive, but there was not like huge jump in terms of popularity of Russia. What Russia did manage to achieve is to shift the blame for its invasion in Ukraine and put the blame on the EU and on NATO. And here it's been quite successful, as the polls have been showing. Now, very briefly, what can be done? How can the EU empower Russia in the region? And again, there's going to be some kind of overlap with what my colleagues have already said, both in terms of countering the disinformation narratives, but like Lisa said, not fighting fire with fire, supporting local media sources, working with local journalists in supporting them in countering Russian narrative. Crucially, in Syria and in Libya, supporting transition in Syria and supporting political process in Libya in order to avoid having a vacuum that Russia is always more than happy to explore. Curtailing Russia's capacity to evade sanctions. So that plays into what Kasper has been saying about the shadow fleet, making sure that Russia, it's more difficult and more costly for Russia, being realistic that we probably can't prevent it 100%, but making it more costly and more difficult for Russia to evade the sanctions through the shadow fleet and through using the MENA countries as kind of bridge, again, from Africa to Russia to smuggle various precious metals, minerals, as well as oil, and benefit financially from that to finance its war efforts in Ukraine. And finally, what we've been arguing throughout the report, it's really important that the EU and its member states remain united in order to not to create a situation that Russia, again, will be more than happy to explore, which is internal divisions and internal, especially taken in the open, disagreements regarding support for Ukraine. I will stop with that to allow us some time to answer the many questions that we've been receiving. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kasia. Yes, let's get to the questions. We have quite a few, as I said, and we welcome even more. We'll try to address them as they come, as many as possible with the 20 minutes or so that we have left. So let's start. The very first one that we received concerned the melting of the polar ice caps and creating new sea transport passageways. So let me start, and Kasper will also add a bit on this. Of course, the northern sea route, more precisely from our perspective, this northwestern sea route is something that features quite prominently in Russia's strategic thought about the Arctic, which as such is a highly important region, of course, for Russia, where some 20% of the GDP is generated. Of course, the changing climate creates certain expectations regarding the use of this northern sea route. The traffic is still way below the expectations and way below the original projections from, let's say, a decade ago. But it's also an area of increasing cooperation between Russia and China, because China is highly interested in exploring this route more and actually investing in the infrastructure. And this is not only investing in the vessels, but also the port infrastructure, the railways, which is a massive investment, a lot of money that Russia doesn't have really. And this is actually becoming a sort of subject of controversy, if you like, in Moscow, where some are sort of welcoming this investment and deeper cooperation, but also there are security considerations in place. Do we want to have this kind of relationship? Do we want to have this kind of Chinese presence in our Arctic region? Which is not to say that there is some sort of imminent conflict or split between Russia and China imminent on this. In our assessment, we tend to be inclined to think that the deepened dependence on China precludes this in the short term, but it's certainly an interesting theme to look into. Kasper, would you like to add something?
I would echo your points on the infrastructure side, because I think that's still the limiting factor in a sense. But I would also potentially add from the energy element is there is already use, particularly through the Yamal LNG terminal, but it requires specialist vessels still. It requires the infrastructure to be in place. So it is already developing or a little bit, but it requires a lot of that has been on hold since 2022. And so we'll see how things develop. But also from the shadow fleet perspective, it is still a hazardous and difficult journey to take. And so for the foreseeable, I don't see dramatic changes in line with what you said.
Many thanks. Then the second question concerns the role of business sector in security, in building resilience, cyber defenses, comms preparations, and Nadia is best suited to answer that one. It's I think very, very important question, because we have this kind of notion of not only a whole of government approach, but a whole of society, which in my view is quite logical, with much of the critical infrastructure now actually distributed, and not all state owned. Many elements of the infrastructure, including cyber, in private hands. So this is what we actually need to have: more public-private collaboration and sort of this whole of society approach. But Nadia, as I said, is best positioned to speak more on that. Please, Nadia.
Thank you, Andrzej, and thank you for this question. I fully second what Andrzej said in the whole of society approach being necessary. But what is also very important is that there is enough investment of the business sector, private sector into these cybersecurity measures, that there is also the increased and maybe even more regular threat assessment. The threats in the digital space are accelerated, they are bigger, the scope is larger, and therefore the investment has to reflect this reality and this threat assessment in a more active and a regular and faster and I would say very thorough way. And secondly, when it comes to the partnership with governments or the public sector also means more transparency and finding a way how to balance out sharing of the information that is necessary for the governments to be able to assess the suitability of the measures and potentially see how better guide or in a way also help regulate and help develop these measures so they're up to the standard and in the competitive and geopolitically tense environment, really reflecting the needs of defense of our digital security, especially as this is about the cyberspace.
Many thanks, Nadia. Then the next question is on the scenario, which is hypothetical, but if you read our report, Kasper actually raises that point of potential environmental disaster, right, caused by shadow fleet, which is encircling the European continent. So in a way, perhaps it's a hypothetical scenario, but not so unrealistic. And what the EU would do in response. So Casper, what do you think?
Well, I certainly share the concern, as is clear in the chapter. I think this is an accident waiting to happen. I think, unfortunately, this is the exact problem with the shadow fleets, at least where there has been incidents in the past. So there's incidents in the Malacca, for example. On the whole, these are ships through which where insurance is unclear, the ownership is obfuscated. There are deliberate ways to try and prevent any harm or any sort of accountability coming back to the Russian state. So how that then looks in terms of how to end up paying for it, or who would end up paying for it, there is effectively an open question, and it would be, but in reality, it's going to be the littoral states. The littoral states will have the initial pay bill of how to manage and how to deal with all this. So it's effectively at the moment it's a bit of a win-win strategy for the Kremlin. They get to export oil, and all the risks are passed on to the littoral states. And so, yeah, I share the concern. That's why we need to act to prevent it, rather than waiting until there's been a disaster.
Very good, thank you. Then we have two questions on escalation. Russia will most likely see these measures, presuming the measures that we propose in the report, as an escalation, and will reply in kind. And is the EUISS and EU ready to respond? And second, Moscow has stated several times that one of the main reasons for hostility is enlargement. What's the EU or EUISS position on EU and NATO enlargement? So let me start by saying that the EUISS is an EU agency. It doesn't take institutional positions on anything. So whatever we hear from us is our views as analysts in the EUISS. We don't take institutional positions, but I think these are important questions to ask. Particularly the first one, we don't have position on enlargement, period. But on escalation, because this is very much, of course, part of the public debate as well. I can share my perspective on this. As I say, this is my personal view. I'm convinced, as someone who's been watching Russia for quite some time, that the Kremlin sees Russia to be locked in sort of, not locked, but in a conflict with what they call the collective West, in war with the collective West, and this war has different manifestations. The terrible war of aggression and destruction which Russia unleashed on Ukraine, with 1.4, close to 1.5 million casualties potentially, and this was a war of choice, of course, that the Kremlin decided to wage. But it's also deploying a wide range of hostile tactics against the EU member states, and we need to respond in kind. Otherwise, we lose, and we are not in kind. Sorry, but we need to respond. Of course, we need to respond by building better resilience, by deterring Russia, by imposing more costs, not responding in kind, of course, because as Nadia alluded to, I mean, these tactics that Russia is deploying against the member states also include campaigns of sabotage, of arson, of cyber attacks, or of jamming, and we don't want to set Russian hospitals on fire, of course, but we need, and this is the very point of the report, we need to think of ways how to limit Russia's capacity to do all these things, and we need to be mindful of the potential steps that Kremlin will take in response. This is, of course, prudent policy. So yes, if we take steps to curtail the shadow fleet passing through the Baltic, yes, we need to be prepared for Russia to increase its military presence there, and to provide military escorts. And we need to think this through, of course. We would not be very clever if we did not. But we also should not be obsessed by the risk of escalation and let it sort of paralyze us in the face of this increasingly brazen increasingly assertive, increasingly aggressive campaigns that the Kremlin is waging against the EU. And I would let anyone of colleagues to add anything if they like on this.
Yeah, Andre, can
Yes.
I come
Please.
in for a minute? I really want to echo what you've said. I mean, I think the report's point, and this is the golden thread that links it all in a way, one of them anyway, is that the agency that we have as sort of, recipients of this hostility. And I think for countries in my region, in the Indo-Pacific, it's important to remember that they aren't passive observers. They're not fence sitters or waiting to be rescued. I think they're also actively calibrating their own positions, hedging where it suits them and balancing old ties with new partners. And for us sitting in Paris or in Brussels, I mean, I think the real challenge it's not about out competing Russia in some zero-sum game. It's about showing that Europe can be a reliable partner that brings stability, transparency, and real long-term value. It's about building that trust, and not by telling these countries to choose sides, but by showing that Europe is committed to supporting their sovereignty, their growth, and their agency. And I think that's a thread that we've tried to do across the report, and that you've really tried to bring out in each of the chapters.
Thank you, Lisa. Nadia?
Yeah, to support and also continue with this reliability of Europe. I don't know if you see me, I just lost the screen. Yeah, so Europe is not only reliable, but also, and I think this is where we are also looking into these ways to make Europe capable, but in a way also deter with its capacities further aggressions. And when it comes to enlargement, be it EU or NATO and also partner countries, the sovereignty has to be also preserved, and the countries have their sovereign rights to decide their future autonomously in a way. So this is something that in the 21st century, I think, is increasingly important to remind ourselves for more cooperative and partner-based future, and try to really deter from this systematic violence and aggression. As you said also, Andre, that in this case is a war of choice and not necessity in any way.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you for the additional points you made. Just to underscore also what Lisa said, because Rosella, who wrote a chapter on Africa, is not with us, but I think her take is very similar. What we propose in the report is not that the EU should engage in some sort of new scramble, for influence in these regions and the geopolitical competition, basically rendering actors, states and societies in these regions as passive, sort of turning these regions into a battlefield, but really come up with mutually beneficial offers, harnessing the global alliances, and so to limit Russia's exercising, malign influence and exploiting the dependencies that it is creating, particularly with the vulnerable and the weak in the plural South. So we have come to the end of the session. I don't see any more questions. So let me thank first of all our speakers today for taking the time and speaking on their topics. Let me thank all of you who've spent your time with us today. I would once again recommend to have a look at the report, unless you've already done so. It's accessible on our website. You will shortly also be able to order a print copy, and of course, as always, you can subscribe to our EUISS newsletter, checking the areas of your interest, and you will receive all of our public production on whatever you are interested in. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.